Thank you, Arthur. And, oh, this is not a deep fake. I'm not Arthur. I'm Giacomo, so I'm just going to swap this so that people understand who I am. So the reason why there is no break between the previous panel and this one is really because we see almost the issue of managing and responding to the deepfake phenomenon really as a part one and part two. You just heard part one, which is the technological responses, and we're now about to enter into the part two, which is governance issues and governance responses. While I make the introduction, I would like just like to invite the speakers that will be joining me on stage to make sure that they're all here. A couple of words of introduction is really, we've really heard today how it is important to have kind of a comprehensive, multi-stakeholder, multi-actor approach to resolving some of the great challenges that deepfakes are posing on us. And when we put together this panel, although we couldn't anticipate that this was the direction in which the conversation was going to go, it is not tremendously far from other types of challenges that have emerged in recent years that are related to the digital world, whether it is cyber, whether it is AI. We hear how important it is to think about these issues in an holistic way. So we have assembled a panel that has pretty much representatives of all of the stakeholder communities that have been mentioned today, with the exception of something that Alexi brought to our attention in an earlier panel, which is the individual actors. So those actors that are acting on their own personal behalf, they're not a business, they're not affiliated with any state or organization whatsoever, they just act out of their own self-interest. We don't have that, but other than that, I think we've covered pretty much every other group. So it is a pleasure to introduce the speakers that will help us in the next panel in trying to unpack some of these governance issues and potential responses, starting with those that are joining me on stage. So I have Marie-Valentine Florin, who is the Executive Director for International Risk and Governance Center at EPFL. We have Yoo-Young Kim from the Council of the National Assembly Research Service of the Republic of Korea. And then going online, we're joined by Juha Heikkila. He's advisor for artificial intelligence at the Directorate for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Industry at the European Commission. Odhran McCarthy, who is program officer at the Center for AI and Robotics at UNICRI. And Joel Roth, who is the head of site integrity at Twitter. So we're really covering the whole spectrum, from academia to industry to national governments, regional organizations, and multilateral organizations. So this is, the platform is here for us to have a very interesting conversation. And this is going to be very similar to the second panel this morning, where I'm just going to go around and ask questions to our speakers and invite them to basically unpack the issues. And I'm going to start with three questions that are really going to set the scene for us, starting with Marie-Valentine. So we have heard in the morning reflections on some of the main risks that the creation, diffusion, and misuse of deepfakes could generate or exacerbate. So can you give us a sense of the lay of the land of what are the possible response strategies?
Thank you, Giorgio, for inviting me. And I'm afraid to some extent we're going to repeat what was said this morning, because actually the world or the community of deepfake, the people who work on deepfake actually do real work on deepfake is relatively small at the moment. So I think there are four types of big response strategies. The first one is around technology, and we've heard a lot about it, especially with Giorgio and the previous session. We need to continue to work on detection techniques. We need to continue to work on the problem, the fact that it is as you said, as was said, a problem of cat and mouse, and that deepfake creators are always ahead of the deepfake users and those that contribute to circulate and disseminate these, what I prefer actually to call digital forgery. I think the word forgery really means that it is bad. Also problem of provenance, problem of certification, of course, and the role of platforms. And I put that under technology because the role of internet platforms, social media platforms, is really, really big, The second area where we have response strategies is basically risk assessment and risk management. We need to better understand where people are actually hurt, people and organizations, what is direct damage, especially when the damage is irreversible, when you cannot compensate that through financial means, for example, but also where the damage is kind of more slowly moving, into transformation of the society, which may not appear as very problematic, but may in the long term be more problematic. Then we have law and regulation, and I think the first thing we need to do there is actually to to receive legal guidance. We need some clarification of the ways in which existing legal frameworks, such as the European Global General Data Protection Regulation (GDPR), applies to deepfakes. In some cases it does, so let's use this. In some cases it does not, and we need to know that. And then regarding law and regulation, we have two streams of response strategies. One is around hard law, and the other one is around soft law. And concerning hard law, there is indeed a case for stronger legal restrictions. But when harm can be demonstrated as being clearly identified and cause damage, if the risk cannot be proved, if there is no evidence of risk, it will be much harder to develop a very specific regulation. For example, in the US, as many of you know, the First Amendment that guarantees the right to free speech makes it unclear whether a ban on convincing video forgeries is indeed constitutional. It is still unclear, And even if the state of California passed a law last year to ban deepfakes during election season, it's not clear whether this can be permanent. Now we have the whole area of soft law, code of conduct, self-regulation, private measures, and I think here again the role of platforms, the role of Facebook, the role of Twitter, as I hope we're going to see, will be very important. And then the fourth area of response strategies is society, of course. We've heard about education, education of leaders, education of society. I would add education of the media and education of data scientists, those who create these things, machine learning developers, because apparently in a lot of universities where this is taught, it seems that students, when they arrive in the curricula, they have some quite a strong ethical background and moral references, which they tend to lose, as they go over their study, which is really bad, and I think we definitely should work on that and improve the education on ethics to all those who have an expertise or develop an expertise to create deepfakes. More globally, and to conclude, I would say digital governance also is something that is a kind of response strategies at societal level. Where deepfake prompts a wider question about internet governance, platform governance, and regulation. I keep back to platform governance because I do think this is a really central role, and including perhaps a role of prevailing incentive structures and business models. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And don't worry about repeating, because I guess this is so new for everyone that the more they hear it, the better it is. Plus, we can
repeat about regulation later.
And we do have a global audience, so some of them might just be connecting now. So it's good to reiterate some of the messages. I just want to go to Joel now and really ask, when Twitter has talked about deepfakes, you have used the broader term of manipulated media. What does that distinction signify in your perspective, and why does it matter?
Thank you for the question, and Giacomo, thank you so much for organizing this discussion. When we've looked at the question of manipulated media and deepfakes at Twitter, we started by looking at what media we'd actually seen on the platform to date that fit in this category. Deepfakes aren't an altogether new phenomena. We've seen some of those technologies used for years to do things like superimpose photos of somebody's face onto the body of another in order to shame and degrade them in the context of non-consensual intimate imagery. And so we've developed policies and strategies that focus on mitigating those harms. But when we conducted an overall census of the space, what we identified was that high sophistication, high technology deepfakes were actually not the majority of the content that we were seeing on the platform. Rather, the most prevalent content that we were seeing were things that were created using much less sophisticated technologies, ranging from sort of 99-cent applications that you can download that could speed up or slow down a video, to things that can modify the text of an image that's in a video or in an image, or even the very low technology option of just sharing a piece of video or an image with false or altered context. And when we looked at all of these, we noted that while there wasn't a unifying technology behind them, there was a unifying harm that was caused by the fact that this media was being shared in a misleading fashion. And so when we started developing a policy approach to it and a set of definitions, we decided not to focus on the technology, but instead to focus on what the outcomes are. By doing that, it gave us a policy approach that was a lot more flexible and resilient to certain types of emerging harm, and that allowed us to not just be caught in a loop of always chasing after a specific set of technologies or trying to build a better or better deepfake detector, echoing on the cat and mouse discussions in the previous session. Instead, we look at what the resulting behavior on Twitter and in the world is. And by focusing on that, we're able to intervene at the point at which people encounter manipulated media. To go to a couple of very recent examples of what we've seen here and sort of why I think this definition is most salient, whenever there's a crisis event in the world, we see that manipulated media plays a part in it. And so as we've looked at events in Afghanistan in recent weeks, we've been documenting the different types of manipulated media that have emerged. The ones that have gotten the most traction on Twitter have been things that don't at all involve high sophistication technology. For example, we've seen media that was slightly doctored to edit the chyron of a news broadcast, allegedly from CNN, to make it seem like CNN were praising the Taliban for wearing masks. Or we've seen instances where videos of planes holding people who were refugees from a certain crisis were being shared out of context as if they were pictures of refugees from Afghanistan. These are things that don't require any particular set of skills or technologies to develop. They're things that anybody could do on their smartphone right now. But they're things that we recognize as being harmful and important to intervene in. And so under our manipulated media policies, we treat all of these as co-equal. And I think that that's an important intervention into the governance discussion here, because in some ways, when you talk about deepfakes, you're talking about sort of the elite community of people who have the skills and knowledge to build the most deceptive, most effective technologies. And what I would posit is what we're dealing with is not just the elite, we're also dealing with the torso of the distribution. We're dealing with the everyday people who are trying to create a meme or trying to share something to go viral, where the harms can be exactly the same. People can be deceived, people can be misled. And in those moments, I think that's where we really need to focus our intervention, not just on specific technologies, but on the ways that those manifest in people's experiences of media.
Thank you. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but I'll get back to you in a second. The last question really to help us set the scene is for Odhran. And the question is, what are the main gaps that you currently see in the governance of deepfakes from an international perspective?
Thanks very much, Giacomo. I think from my perspective, I think the main gap is probably that there's no coordinated international effort with respect to the governance of deepfakes or even AI in general. I mean, there's several international and regional soft law legal instruments that provide guidance in terms of the development of, fair, ethical, robust AI. But AI itself is not really regulated from the international perspective at all. And I think without having some sort of understanding of how we're going to govern AI, it's hard in a way to understand how we should govern deepfakes. As I'm sure we've heard throughout the day, and I apologize I couldn't attend earlier parts of the session, but as I'm sure we've heard throughout the day, the European Commission has recently presented its proposal for an EU regulation on AI. And while this is a very, very positive and promising development in terms of the governance of AI, I think it's important to remember that this is, it's still just a proposal. There's still a long road ahead of it. And I think it's also important to remember that this is still a regional proposal coming out of Europe. Whereas, the phenomenon of deepfakes is in a way, it's a global challenge. So we need a global approach. Looking beyond the lack of an international governance framework of AI, I think another challenge is, and echoing Marie-Valentine here, I think is in terms of the enforcement of existing laws. You know, when we're talking about governance, we don't always need to develop from scratch. And there's a lot of existing international and regional treaties and legal instruments, for instance, particularly in the field of copyright law and data protection, that can provide guidance in terms of, you know, combating the production and spread of deepfakes. International human rights law, I think, is another body of law that we can refer to in terms of, you know, guidance and in terms of the legal obligations with respect to the right to privacy, freedom of opinion and expression, and so on. So as I said, we don't always need to build from scratch. I think it's important that we reflect on what we already have and see how we can build upon it. And a third point that I would say in terms of gaps, and again, also echoing Marie-Valentine here again, I think is the role of the private sector. As of right now, there's no real international frameworks addressing the responsibility of private companies. For example, for their role with respect to the spread of deepfakes, or for instance, with respect to notice and takedown procedures, or even cooperation between the public and private sector for you know, investigation and so on. So I think this is a further important issue that we need to pick up going forward. So I think that those for me are the kind of three primary gaps: the lack of coordinated international approach, lack of enforcement of existing laws, and building more on the role of the private sector in this challenge.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to use your last point as a bridge to the next kind of a segment of our Q&A, which is really about current responses. And because you've mentioned the role of the private sector, I'm just going to go back straight to Joel and really ask you, how does Twitter deal with manipulated media and deepfakes when you encounter them on your platform? What kind of trends, you know, have you observed and you can share with us on the use of this technology? Because of course, we've talked a lot today about the generation or creation of these manipulated media at different levels of sophistication, but platforms, so any social media platform has, you know, plays a key role in the dissemination and reach of these kind of manipulated media. So how is Twitter handling the situation?
Sure. I'm going to go back a little in time a little bit to 2019, when Twitter first started work on developing our policy on synthetic and manipulated media. We recognized in 2019 that this was an area that was insufficiently clear in our policies and did require something more specific. The triggering event for us was actually a relatively low sophistication piece of manipulated media featuring Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. And this was a video of Speaker Pelosi, it was a normal recording of her speaking, and it was doctored using an app on a phone to slightly slow down the cadence of the video. And so as a result of being slowed down, it appeared that Speaker Pelosi's speech was slurred, and it was circulated on Twitter and on other social media platforms saying, "Look at Speaker Pelosi, she's drunk on the job." And it was being circulated as an attempt at humor. But it raised a number of interesting questions for us, and I think for platforms broadly, about how we deal with these types of manipulations where it might not be clear from the context in which it's shared or from the video itself what it is that's going on. Is this true? Is this real? Our first step was to conduct a broad, open study of what it is that people wanted platforms to do here. I think in a lot of the governance and regulatory conversations, there's rightfully discussions about the roles of platforms, but platforms are themselves composed of millions of people who are using them worldwide, interacting with the technologies that we build within the company. And so we started by going to our community around the world, and we conducted large-scale quantitative and qualitative research to try and understand community expectations of intervention. Unsurprisingly, an overwhelming majority of people who we talked to said, yes, this is a problem, and yes, we expect Twitter to do something about it. We knew that was going to be the response. But what was more interesting for us was there was not broad alignment, although there were some trends, about what it was that people wanted us to do. For example, we found that globally about 60% of people did not want Twitter to be in the position of categorically removing all manipulated media. Instead, there was general alignment around Twitter taking steps to provide people with authoritative context. And I think this is a really important distinction. When we asked people, presented with the facts of harmful manipulated media, whether the response that they were looking for was for the platform to take it down and remove it entirely, they said no, they want to see it, but they want to have access to credible information that could allow them to evaluate it in a more sophisticated and informed way. And that became the basis of our policy interventions here. And so our policy on synthetic and manipulated media begins first from a question of, is this media manipulated? And if so, how? And what are the sources that we're using to establish the fact that it's manipulated? That could be a technological source, so it could be a detection that we develop and maintain for whether the media is manipulated. But more often, it's the product of investigative journalism and open source research, where people look for evidence that this media is being shared out of context, that it was doctored, they find the original source of it and compare it. And the beauty of being an open and public platform like Twitter is that often those conversations are happening in public, in real time on our service. And so as a policy intervention, we're able to apply labels to tweets that identify them clearly as manipulated. And then if you tap on those labels, you're taken to additional context that explains precisely what that manipulation is, not coming from Twitter, but coming from outside experts, coming from journalists, coming from researchers who are able to be a voice of authority on some of these issues. And I think that that really represents one of the points where, as we think about the question of manipulated media and deepfake governance generally, we should recognize that this is happening in the context of a broad community of defenders. And I think that, as was hinted at in the previous panel, that's going to be one of the ways we pull ourselves out of the cat and mouse challenges here. But I really do want to emphasize that as we've approached this issue, we've observed that removal is not going to be one of the strategies that resonates strongly with our communities across the board. Second, we have to rely on a community-sourced approach to identification and detection of deepfakes and other manipulated media. And third, we really have to prioritize getting context into the hands of people who are encountering this media.
Thank you, Joel. I now just want to shift a little bit the focus more at the national level, and I have a question for Yu Yang here in the room with us. So self-regulation is a basic principle of governance in many countries. However, it comes with its own limitations somehow. So what do you think are specific roles that governments and tech platforms should play to curb the spread of deepfakes? What is your perspective on this?
Yes. Considering the two-sided nature of deepfake technology, there is a case that the government can refer to what kind of policy response it should take. With the development of AI technology patents are also rapidly increasing, and of course, there are also deepfake patents. In Korea, patent applications related to deepfakes are increasing, and the Korean Intellectual Property Office is probably thinking about this issue. Deepfake is a technology in the early stage of development, and since the potential of the technology has not been fully revealed yet, excessive regulation can suppress technological development. Typically, synthetic data made with deepfake generation technology can play an important role in resolving the lack of data necessary for the development of AI. Synthetic medical data generation through deepfakes can be very useful in terms of protecting personal sensitive information and confidentiality. It is necessary to respond in the direction of preventing the spread of illegal deepfake information rather than regulating the technology itself. At this time, there are not many academic researches on their effects, but examining the spread of deepfakes shows the following three main characteristics. First, the spread of deepfake is a sporadic network, difficult to control, and initially spreads faster than the real things. It is necessary to quickly determine fake and factual information at the initial stage of occurrence. Second, the aim of deepfake is to trace the information space so the people gives up looking for any truth amid the chaos. There is a need for a prompt response from an institution with public credibility. Third, it is important to quickly disseminate the fact-checked results Studies have shown that after someone fact-checks, fake information is no longer spread. The role of government and technology platforms can be drawn from the above characteristics of this information. In the short term, the most effective solutions could come from major technology platforms that voluntarily take more stringent measures to limit the spread of illegal deepfakes. The technology platform should play a role in early stage detection and diffusion blocking. As a next step, the government should provide prompt judgment on deepfakes as a credible institution. In this process, it will be necessary for journalists, fact-checkers, and citizens to collaborate to disseminate fact-checked results quickly.
Thank you. I just have a quick follow-up while we have you on the microphone. So could you elaborate on some specific examples of policies or countermeasures that your government is developing to counter this threat?
Yes. As revealed in the research results on deepfake, 95% of deepfakes distributed worldwide are deepfake pornography. And it turns out that many of them use images of popular idols and actors in Korea. Deepfakes pose a real threat to the people, including Korean celebrities. Looking beyond purely technological remedies, what legislative, political, and social steps can we take to defend against deepfakes' dangers? One tempting and simple solution is to pass laws that make it illegal to create or spread deepfakes. However, the total ban on deepfakes has both constitutional and practical problems. Korea is taking a more direct response to the specific point of damage, namely deepfake pornography. Korea has already passed a bill to prevent pornography and falsely manipulated information using deepfakes, and it is mandatory for technology platforms to prepare measures for the development and dissemination of deepfake image identification technology. Also, a bill to facilitate the deletion of deepfake pornography is currently being proposed in the National Assembly. The bill stipulates that the victim's representative can request support for the deletion of deepfake footage, and if necessary, the state can delete it. Regarding the effects of deepfakes in election held in some regions, Korea has a very strong election law, so no separate legislative effort is being made. In the future, if the damage of deepfake is further expanded and become a reality, there is a possibility that election security-related policy responses and laws that strengthen the obligations of technology platforms in relation to deepfakes will be discussed.
Thank you. So if we move now from the national to the regional level, and I go now to Juha, I mean, we've already heard the proposal of the European Commission being mentioned by previous speakers. But if we put deepfakes in the broader bucket of potential harmful uses of AI, can you elaborate on what concrete measures are proposed in this regulatory framework that the European Commission is working on?
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I can give a quick overview of what it entails. So first of all, I should, by way of clarification to those who do not know what it's about and what it contains, so the proposed regulation, AI regulation by the European Commission, it has a risk-based approach. And it addresses basically what are considered to be harmful use of AI. So it does not target AI directly as a technology as such, but it will tackle certain uses of AI which are considered to be harmful. And in this proposal that we published in April, there is, if you like, a risk pyramid, a sort of hierarchy of risks. So at the very tip of the pyramid, we have those uses of artificial intelligence that we consider to be so harmful that they should in fact be banned. And this includes, there are sort of four main things. One is subliminal manipulation resulting in harm. And of course, this could well concern deepfakes and the kinds of effects that they have. Secondly, there is the exploitation of children and other vulnerable groups. General purpose social scoring is the third category. And then remote biometric identification for law enforcement purposes. So those are the kind of banned uses of AI that we consider to be so harmful that they should not be accepted at all. But then there is the next category, which is the high-risk systems, which then is interesting perhaps for many reasons. And they are uses of AI which are possible as long as certain conditions are met and certain requirements are fulfilled. And there are a number of these, there are two main categories. One is safety components in regulated products, so products that are already subject to legislation, and safety components involving AI. This would be, for example, medical devices. And then certain standalone AI systems in a number of fields, which include, for example, biometric identification and categorization, management of critical infrastructure, law enforcement, and a number of others. And for these high-risk systems, then, there is a certain number of requirements that are introduced in this proposal. They concern data, training, validation, and testing data, documentation and design locking features, transparency, and the need to provide information to users as to how to use the systems, human oversight, and robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. So these are the kinds of requirements that are put on the high-risk systems. And then, of course, there should be a risk management system in place, and this should take into account the intended purpose of the system and the use of the system. And I should emphasize that this is a life cycle approach. So there are certain requirements. The design has to be in line with what is stipulated in the regulation. Then there is the ex-ante conformity assessment, which is required in those cases where we have a high-risk system which cannot be put on the market as such. Then there is post-market monitoring that is provided for these kinds of systems to understand what is going on, to see how this works in practice, an incident report system, and potentially a new conformity assessment in case of modification. And there is a list of high-risk uses, areas of high-risk use of AI in that regulation. And I have to emphasize that this is something that can actually be revised and will be revised. So it's not cast in stone, but it is dynamic and can take into account the different systems that emerge and the changes in the existing systems, which, of course, as we all understand, is very important. And in this area also, it is very important. So it does not identify this particular category of use of AI as such or any other, but it identifies areas of high-risk uses of AI and then a small number of uses of AI that are completely banned. So that's how we go about regulating AI according to the proposal that is now in the political process.
Thank you. And the last piece of the puzzle here is the multilateral level. So Odhran, back to you. How has the deepfake phenomenon been addressed at the level of the UN?
I would say that, much like the rest of the world, I think the UN is still trying to get up to speed with what, the phenomenon of deepfakes really means and how it impacts us. So as a result, I would say that, discussions in the UN, I think, are very much still in a nascent stage. That said, I think, the issue of deepfakes itself, and as well as the broader and wider yet related issue of the erosion of public trust, I think is something that has already been acknowledged several times at the highest levels of the UN. And Secretary General Antonio Guterres has several times already acknowledged his concerns about, growing political instability, this mistrust between, the governments and the public. And he's also highlighted, the role that technology can play in amplifying the harmful effects of this. For instance, at the recent opening of the 74th session of the General Assembly, he characterized this growing mistrust as one of the four horsemen that threaten our global future. And alongside this, he also characterized the dark side of the digital world as being another of the horsemen. And so I think this kind of symbolic metaphors, I think, is quite powerful in terms of how he himself perceives this. Specifically on deepfakes, only a few weeks ago, there was the second United Nations high-level conference on the heads of counterterrorism agencies. And again here, Secretary General specifically flagged deepfakes in the context of counterterrorism, expressing concern about the potential for terrorist groups and violent extremist groups to be able to use the technology to to spread conspiracy theories and so on. And he called upon member states to specifically take action to prevent these technologies from falling into the hands of malicious actors such as terrorists. Aside from these kind of high-level remarks from Secretary General himself, several other UN entities within the system have also recognized, I suppose, the challenge or the dangers related to deepfakes and already started taking action in terms of raising awareness about the effects of deepfakes and building kind of public knowledge, I think, as well, within our system and externally. So, for instance, earlier this year, the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom of Opinion and Expression released a report in which she specifically highlighted the role of digital technology, in particular deepfakes and shallow fakes, in terms of distorting reality and amplifying the spread of false information. Aside from that, say, for instance, the International Telecommunications Union has been quite active flagging its concern about the growing proliferation of deepfakes. The UN University has also done in-depth analysis of the effects of deepfakes. My own organization, UNICRI, so the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, we've been looking at deepfakes for several years now. We've been trying to build knowledge and understanding about the different risks. They could be maliciously used by criminals and terrorists. To date, we've put out a couple of reports. We did a recent report with Europol and Trend Micro, in which we highlighted how AI in general can be maliciously used in cyber attacks. And we've had a specific kind of case study in terms of the use of deepfakes in this regard. And only just very recently, we released a report together with the UN Office of Counterterrorism, looking at, further down the line, what might we see in terms of the innovation, in terms of the tools and technologies that terrorist groups and individuals might use. Again, specifically flagging out the role that deepfakes might play, for instance, in the spread of false information, incitements to violence, calls for action, and as well as other kind of more complex examples, including how deepfakes might be used in terms of complex fundraising strategies for terrorist groups. Beyond this kind of the general knowledge development, we've also been working in terms of supporting research and the development of deepfake detection tools. A couple of years back, we organized a challenge at the Hackathon for Peace, Justice and Security, challenging researchers from across the globe to come up with potential detection tools. And I think this was a promising, an initial but a promising exercise that we did. So I mean, just to recap, I think we've already seen several high-level references to the issue of deepfakes, and we started to see already a lot of UN entities within the system taking action in terms of knowledge development, awareness raising, and so on. But I think we're still, still a little bit away from having some sort of concrete discussion on the governance of AI within the UN system itself.
Thank you, Odhran. And for the last kind of round of questions before we start addressing some of the very interesting ones coming from the audience, I really want you all to look ahead and be a little bit forward-looking. So I just want to go back to Joel for one last question to you. So when it comes to deepfakes, how can the technology sector get out of the famous cat and mouse game that we've heard so many times today already, of adversarial detection and response, and then the technology becomes better and so on and so forth. So won't there always be someone making, or using a better technique for producing convincing deepfakes?
I think we should begin from the premise that there always will be somebody producing a better or more convincing deepfake. And I think an effective response here, I recognize the irony as a technologist in saying this, is to not focus on the technology. I think we have to go back to much more foundational offline strategies for promoting resilience. When we look at sort of other domains of disinformation, a lot of the most effective responses we've seen have been ones that recognize that disinformation is a society-level security challenge and not one that can be solved by technology platforms or developing better software alone. To give a couple of examples, I think if you look at, for instance, hack and leak campaigns associated with cyber intrusions, this was something that as people became more aware of it, we could start to develop more resilient strategies for managing these things when they happen. We don't begin from a premise of saying we can always universally prevent intrusion into private networks. We don't start from a premise of saying we can prevent threat actors from disclosing information they get when they hack people. We begin from an assumption that those things will happen because security isn't perfect. And we then turn to the question of what's the most effective or responsible way of reporting on a hack and leak when it happens? Because some of the most prominent cases that we've seen in Ukraine, in the United States, and elsewhere have been instances where the hack and leak itself happens, and where we failed was doing the adversary's work for them by then reporting on the product of the hack and leak. And I think we can apply that same lesson to the context of deepfakes and other forms of manipulated media. It's never just going to be sufficient to build a better detector, especially because some of the technologies here are so unsophisticated that detecting them is essentially a trivial endeavor from a technical standpoint. We should start asking the question, what are the skills we need to be equipping people with to understand this? What are the skills that reporters and journalists need to have to be able to do source verification? What are technologies that we can build, again, going back to some of the discussions in the previous panel, to help create a pipeline of trusted content from the lens of a camera through to a TV screen or a computer or a phone? These are the sorts of things that if we start to intervene at a systems level there, we can start to get at the much broader and thornier question of an erosion of trust at the societal level. And finally, I think we need to focus on growing the community of defenders who are focused on some of these challenges. When I look at Twitter's experience working on manipulated media, I always come back to the fact that one of the most potent tools in our arsenal is the fact that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people worldwide who are focused on identifying manipulated media and sharing their findings in real time. We see this play out every single day on our platform. And it's not just something that's the product of hobbyists who are, using TinEye and reverse image search to try and find where media came from. These are people who are committed to a healthy public conversation and to the maintenance of democratic governance through shared reality. And they instantiate that by doing this research and doing it in public. The more that we can amplify their voices, the more that we can train people on how to use those skills themselves and engage in source verification as an everyday practice, the more that we take the management of manipulated media out of this space of being a governmental problem or a regulatory problem or a technical problem, and we move it into the space of being a societal problem. And I think all of the stakeholders represented here have a part to play in that, but I don't think we're going to be able to solve it by just looking for a magic bullet of technological detection. In my experience, we are always going to end up a step behind a creative and dedicated and sophisticated adversary. We need to think about what comes next. And I think that societal level resilience measures are the key to starting to get ahead of that.
Thank you, Juha. And this is actually a perfect segue. I have a question for Marie-Valentine about, how can or should governance be used to mitigate this societal impact that Juha was referring to of deepfakes in the future?
Yeah, so I assume in that context that we use the term governance as the kind of set of formal and informal arrangements to organize decisions, authority, and how things are made in society. So basically anything that, except the very technical ones. And indeed it starts with actually what is the harm and that is caused by deepfakes, harm caused to individuals, harm caused to organizations. And in that case, we need to show the intended purpose of damage or manipulation of people, organizations. At the third level, which is a societal level, we have to adopt a more broader, pervasive, broader view that looks at the pervasive, slow change of society in response to technological change, and vice versa, by the way. So we are now beginning to realize the power of machine learning. I mean, society is beginning to realize, beyond science fiction, beyond specific use cases, the power of machine learning used to creating deepfake, the power of social platforms and social media to disseminate that to a broader audience, the vulnerability of people who are being affected and quite often who have absolutely no idea on how to detect that. I mean, yes, there are tools available to them, but I think that the majority of people are not even aware and not even willing or not even basically to some extent, they do nothing against it. They use it, they consume it as a consumer good. They find it's fun, we don't have the same perception as the majority of people. I want to remember that there is still a broad acceptance in society of synthetic media. People see it for the role in movies, in entertainment, and the very narrow focus on deepfake is very unique in society. I mean, the billions of people who live in this world. So we have a problem in the fact that many users do not even care about knowing the truth. The community of people who work around detection is we need to help this community to get broader traction and to have more role in society. So the role, the dramatic and potentially devastating consequences on society with could be, this is, I think, what we need to work on to make people understand that this is serious. None of the possible response strategies is easy to implement for a variety of reasons. We've talked about the fact that any intervention to regulate, begins with the establishment of conditions of legality. We need to create the legal basis in many cases, and that banning, labeling, removing is on the side of those who contribute to disseminating. That must also align with the business models in a way, in the sense that for organizations that get much of their revenue from, we need to find incentives in such a way that actors in this deepfakes dissemination phenomena can actually find a good reason, some economic rationale to fight it completely, seriously. What else? I also would like to emphasize that I think indeed it is a global problem, but I don't know what kind of global solution would be if any kind of global solution or global governance arrangement is possible. I tend to think that that institutions have a role there, but that the solution will not necessarily be developed by institutions. Because deepfake is a symptom of something that happens completely outside of institutions. And it's one of the major, it's a symptom, as I said, it's a tip of the iceberg, but something on which institutions have currently very little power to act. Things happen elsewhere. And we don't have a governance arrangements to deal with that. In a way, it's a bit similar to the blockchain phenomena, which tends to say, okay, we can create distribution and we distribute trust, and we don't need a central authority to tell us what can be trusted. Trust can be distributed among us. Okay, that's the concept. But in the reality, it is very, very different. We also have the problem of that I would call the free riding problem. That if a jurisdiction is very effective at countering deepfakes, then the deepfake producers just go elsewhere. This is not unique to deepfake and machine learning. It happens in lots of other domains. Whether that is true or not is debatable. It may not be true, but I think we may wish to look at other domains where similar problems exist and look at the kind of response strategies that are being developed to tackle the problems in these cases. Finally, I just would like to say about this question of trust and truth. As many of you, there are sort of claims, voices, that raise the flag, the fact that we're moving to something called a post-truth society. And what does it mean, this post-truth society? And this is another aspect that I think is perhaps even more revealing of what happens in society than simply the deepfake symptom of phenomena. It is the fact that a post-truth society would be a society where shared objective, shared standards for truth are being disappearing, But there is a kind of slippage and confusion between facts, alternative facts, knowledge, scientific evidence, opinion, belief, and truth. But this doesn't mean that there cannot be trust between people. This doesn't mean that you can't have communities that share the same understanding of trustworthy relationships. You can have a kind of contractual trust that develops between individuals that replaces institutional truth developed by institutions. And so we move into the post-trust society, where we also say that where we say that trust is needed. We might argue that no, we no longer need the same kind of trust among institutions and people. You can have different types of trustworthiness relationship where you just have confidence that a given operation, a transaction, is okay. So, if we think broad about deepfake, we have to think about a bit outside of the box of the conventional way to develop response strategies and governance arrangements that fits the need of the current legitimate institutions.
Thank you. And I want to go back to Yu Yang. And based on the lessons that we've learned during the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to how quickly and to what scale misinformation can be distributed and disseminated, what kind of international cooperation mechanism do you think could be established to help individual governments deal with this misinformation problem?
In the COVID-19 era, countries around the world have had to fight not only the virus called COVID-19, but also this misinformation and fake news wrapped in science. Important insight can be gained on the response to a common international issue through the dissemination of a huge amount of COVID-19 dis and misinformation. The impact of this disinformation on real people's perception of COVID-19 and the effort of countries to respond. First, importance of the international networks on the COVID-19 misinformation. IFCN, the International Fact-Checking Network, played an important role as a base for international fact-checking activities. Their database united fact-checkers in more than 70 countries and includes articles published in at least 40 languages. As soon as disinformation about COVID-19 and vaccines are found in one area, fact-checkers from around the world, centering on IFCN, on International Fact-Checking Network, fact-checked disinformation in each area in real time. Such cases can be an important reference for future deepfake countermeasures. Deepfakes that are combined with various scientific information in various regions or are raised in political contexts are difficult to respond to without international cooperation on fact-checking at the regional level. Second, role of experts worldwide is important. When analyzing this misinformation about COVID-19, automatic translation becomes easier. So this misinformation translated through the internet is spreading. People are generally more inclined to believe information that impersonated experts such as scientists and medical personnel. Therefore, it is important for the expert group to correct each misinformation And according to research, the spread of disinformation stopped once the experts correct it. There is a good example in Korea. This is a movement called Fact Before Rumors that scientists started in relation to the spread of various kinds of disinformation during the corona period. Recognizing the importance of expert intervention in preventing the spread of disinformation, they delivered infographics in about 20 languages to over 50,000 people in 70 countries, with the voluntary participation of experts in each field. This means that in a reality where it is difficult to completely block the creation of deepfakes, prompt correction by experts is important to block the distribution. And the simultaneous provision of information at the international level is important when considering the rapid global spread. In response to deepfakes, cooperation between international fact-checking institutions and cooperation of experts should be considered.
Thank you. And one last question for Juha. And I do apologize, I'm going to ask you to be as brief as you can, but yet as informative as you can. So the question is, what kind of added value does a regional approach to governance bring when compared to individual initiatives or measures that can be designed and implemented at the national level?
Thanks. Well, I'll try to be brief. So first of all, it does, even if it's only regional, it does combat fragmentation of the framework, and it does help in that respect. When I'm thinking about that area of the world that I represent, the European Union, so of course for us it's important that we have a uniform, predictable and safe operating environment and legal certainty in regard to these kinds of phenomena. And although the kinds of requirements that we have for high-risk systems or banned systems, and by the way, I actually omitted to mention one thing I wanted to mention, which is the transparency requirements in the proposed regulation which concern deepfakes. So the transparency requirements are there and requires labeling of these systems. Now, of course, these will only work in our jurisdiction, and we have the jurisdictional problem here, which was already hinted at. Nevertheless, it does actually set an example, and that example can be very valuable, and then inspire and invite others to also take similar measures. And this is where we also then, as the European Commission, European Union, we work quite actively on the international scene in different international forums, but also bilaterally. I just mentioned, for example, the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence and the OECD, where we are active and where we then promote and advocate the kinds of principles that we are doing. And I can see this also from the reaction that is gaining traction. This, of course, does not solve the jurisdictional problem because we only have jurisdiction in that part of the world that we are in. But of course, the systems that are put on the market and are used, regardless of where they come from, they have to comply with these requirements. So these are the kinds of things that I think make it still worthwhile, the regional attempts, because they do still affect more than just an individual country or individual region even, or company or whatever. And then there could be this snowballing effect, which can be very, very useful. So that would be my short answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the insightful answer, despite being very concise. So thank you for that. So Odhran, I haven't forgotten about you, and I'm actually going to give you the privilege of being the first to answer this question that has been sitting on our platform since 5 hours ago. It was one of the first questions that was submitted, and it's also the most voted one. Basically, it reads as follows: countermeasures to deepfakes, or responding to deepfakes, is a multi-stakeholder responsibility. We heard that throughout the day. But who should take the lead? Who should start and potentially have the responsibility of regulating it? Is it the private or is it the public sector? Because we're now in a situation where everybody recognizes that it's a multi-stakeholder responsibility, but no one is taking the first step. So who should start and take the lead?
Thanks very much. To be honest, I think, as I said before, I mean, deepfakes is a global phenomenon. This is something that's impacting us all across the globe. So I think in that regard, I think it's paramount that, everybody be involved. I mean, that we have to have all states across the globe involved. Because, I mean, also, the reality is that when we're talking about the governance of AI, we're talking as well at the same time about how do we, maximize the benefits of a technology and minimize the risks. So when we're talking about these kind of like trade-offs, we can't have this as an elite kind of discussion amongst a certain group of states or entities or organizations. This is to be an open and comprehensive, inclusive process. I mean, because if we start excluding people, particularly I'm thinking about developing countries, if they're not at the table involved in participating in the discussion, then we start getting into a situation where we start leaving countries behind. So I think, in terms of, how do we go forward and who does it, who takes the lead, I think this has to be a collective effort involving all member states. I think it also has to be a process involving all different stakeholders, because these are incredibly complex issues. The challenges that we're facing here are very multifaceted. So, I mean, we can't have this as a situation where a certain, again, as I said, a certain group of governments or authorities make a decision. This has to be an informed collective process involving all different stakeholders, national authorities, private sector, civil society organizations, of course, also very important, recognizing that, whatever measures we take in terms of the governance of AI may have an impact on the, for instance, the freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and so on, and opinion. So I think, we have to involve civil society organizations, academia, of course, also another important stakeholder that is to be involved, and any other stakeholders that play a role. So I think, hard to say who should take the first step. Very often people are reluctant to be the one who takes the first step. But I think, however we go forward, this has to be an inclusive, collective process.
Thank you. Marie-Valentine, do you think you can try to, what would be your perspective on that?
I would suggest there's no one in particular that should take the lead. The problem is fully distributed, so the solution should also be fully distributed. So everybody has a role there. Talking from governments, I would say there are a number of barriers and obstacles that need to be removed or overcome before the governments can take the lead, including sometimes creating the constitutional legal basis to act, which is not an easy job. On the side of the private sector, I would say some depend. Some have their commercial revenues that depend on sensational news. As long as this removes like this, it will be difficult for them to take serious action. So we need to find incentives, business incentives, to take action. So, it's at various levels. The education system has also a huge role to play from primary school to university education, media literacy, learning what is the truth, and learning, teaching children that no, perhaps there are things that they should not believe in, that's perhaps something to begin with. So I think action should be distributed. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to try with another question here, and perhaps, Juha, this is one for you, but it reads, what would be the roles and responsibilities of cross-border digital platforms and global social media platforms in this regard, in the context of prevention and real-time combat of these threats for all nations?
Sure. I can connect this, I think, to the previous question and say, well, I don't know who should take the lead. I think what we've seen in practice is that the largest technology companies and platforms have played a leading role in the management of deepfakes and manipulated media without waiting for regulation to compel us to do so. I think you've seen this from Twitter, from Facebook, from Google, YouTube, Microsoft. Each of us have taken specific technology and policy development steps to address deepfake issues without needing to be compelled legislatively to do so by any one of the jurisdictions in which we operate. And so I think there is a leading role for technology here to first build the technologies that help us find and detect and mitigate deepfakes and manipulated media at scale. It's an area where we can also help build institutions that allow us to collaborate on a number of these issues. There are models that we've deployed effectively in spaces like countering terrorism through organizations like the GIFT-CT, to allow industry to collaborate and share information about these threats so that these efforts aren't happening within specific silos. And then I think there's obviously important spaces for collaboration between technology platforms and the public sector, NGOs, civil society groups, researchers, to promote sort of public education strategies. The one sort of caveat I'd throw out here is when we talk about the role of the private sector, oftentimes attention focuses rightfully on the biggest platforms. As the representative of Twitter here, I'll note Twitter is sometimes the smallest of the big platforms, or maybe the biggest of the small platforms, but we should recognize that there's a very large distribution of what it means to be a part of the private sector. And while I think that you've seen the biggest technology platforms take a leading role on this issue, there are a lot of other platforms out there, some of which intentionally do not intervene in some of these issues and take it as a point of ideology that they don't have a responsibility here. And so when we're thinking about what the role of regulatory or legislative approaches is, I think we certainly want to protect and promote an open internet that fosters competition, but we should also recognize that the biggest actors are often the ones who are acting the most responsibly. And we're dealing with a much larger ecosystem within which harmful and misleading content can circulate.
Thank you. I'm going to go with a question to all of you, and please do raise your physical virtual hand so I can see you. Are there any initiatives that are specifically built to establish bridges between civil society, academia, the private sector, and governments to educate and prevent the misuse of deepfake? Are you aware of any dedicated initiative that is being put together with the purpose of connecting the various communities of stakeholders? I see a lot of heads shaking, so I'm assuming there's no such a thing that people are aware of. Well, here we go. We have identified a gap and a very interesting research question for us to take forward at UNIDIR. There is a question that perhaps Juha can shed light on, and is really about, I'm just going to read it from the platform. It says that there is an EU code of practice on disinformation, which has been adhered to by Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, TikTok, and Google. How effective will the code be, and respected and implemented, so that the social media are accountable and at the same time preserve the freedom of expression?
So I'm not able to provide any numbers or any kind of, if you like, research results on that and how effective it is. And in that regard, I think that's an open question. It's also largely a question of perception, because this is something that we do deal with a lot. So, it goes back to the question of trust, of course, because trust is something that we have noticed and we all know is very important. But in our discussions with the general public on the one hand, and the stakeholders, the developers of these systems, users of these systems, we notice that trust is very important. And of course, the public perception of what is effective may not always necessarily correspond to the reality in some respects. For example, if we think about, give you an example from a completely different field, if we think about the employment effects of digital technologies more generally, this is something where a large proportion of the population thinks that it's negative and very negative, whereas the economists who work on this topic, they come up with very different predictions, and some of them are not particularly negative, others are more pessimistic. So this is one of the things where of course we cannot really say. As I said, I don't have any numbers to give you, but at the heart of the approach that we have adopted towards AI in general is to ensure that AI systems in general can be used safely and with confidence in an environment of trust, because we think that trust is essential for the uptake of this technology, and the uptake, of course, is essential and necessary for the benefits of this technology to materialize. So the lack of trust can lead to rejection of this technology and the loss of the beneficial effects that could result from the use of this technology in a responsible manner.
Thank you. And with that, I'm afraid we're running out of time, although there's still 16 questions pending. I'm afraid we will need a whole other day to go over them all. But it's been an incredibly inspiring panel. Thank you so much to all of our speakers who engaged with us in the discussion. Please join me in a physical and a virtual applause for those that are online. We are about to go on a short break before our last high-level panel. But before we do that, I just wanted to share with our virtual and physical audience the link to our feedback form. It is really important that we capture your impressions for the day so that we can always try to make the next event better. So please, if you are logging in, do scan the QR code with your phone. If you're here in the room, you also have a physical feedback form on your desks if you prefer to do that. And with that, we're just going to adjourn the meeting and see you back in the room in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.